December 24th, 1894. The newspapers called it the miracle of Grosvenor Square. But those inside the Ashbury ballroom knew it was no miracle, it was a reckoning. For 3 years the Duke of Ashbury had worn black mourning a wife the world believed had perished in the icy waters of the Thames. He was seconds away from announcing a new betrothal, a political union, to save his crumbling estate, when the heavy oak doors groaned open. The music died. The laughter stopped. Because there, standing in a dress the colour of spilled wine, was the Duchess everyone had buried. She didn't just return from the dead. She returned with a secret that would hang every person in that room. The chandeliers of Ashbury House did not sparkle that Christmas Eve. They glared. To Arthur Cavendish, the 9th Duke of Ashbury, the thousands of crystals suspended above the ballroom floor looked like judging eyes, cold and unblinking. Outside London was buried under a foot of fresh snow. The silence of the city broken only by the rattle of carriages, delivering the elite of Victorian society to his doorstep. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of pine-roasted chestnut and the cloying perfume of desperation. Arthur stood near the fireplace, swirling a glass of amber whiskey he had no intention of drinking. He was a man composed of sharp angles and darker moods, his once easy smile having vanished exactly 3 years, 2 months and 4 days ago. "You must look happier, Arthur," a voice hissed at his elbow. "The Prime Minister is watching." Arthur didn't turn. He knew that tone. It was his mother, the Dowager Duchess Augusta. She was a woman built of steel corsets and sheer will, currently draped in purple silk that cost more than the annual wages of his entire staff. "I'm not happy, Mother," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble. "I am resigned. There is a difference." "Resignation is enough," Augusta snapped, snapping her fan open. "Lady Rosalind is a good match. Her father's shipping empire will restore the family coffers. You need this. The title needs this. Genevieve is gone, Arthur. You cannot stay married to a ghost." Genevieve. The name hit him like a physical blow. Even now, saying it felt like inhaling broken glass. Lady Genevieve Sterling, his Evie. The woman with the laugh that could disarm a room and a temper that could clear it. The official police report stated she had slipped from the darker edge of Blackfriars Bridge on a foggy October night. They had found her cloak. They had found her locket. They had never found her body. "I am doing what is required," Arthur said, setting his glass down on the mantelpiece with a sharp clack. "I will announce the engagement at midnight. Until then, leave me be." He walked away before she could protest, cutting a path through the crowd. He nodded to the Earl of Derby, ignored a simpering wave from a debutante, and found himself staring at the orchestra. They were playing a waltz, Strauss, he thought idly. It was the same waltz he and Evie had danced to at their wedding. "A tragic figure, isn't he?" Arthur stiffened as he heard the whispers behind him. 2 elderly matrons were hiding behind their fans. "Tragic, perhaps, but foolish," the second woman murmured. "Everyone knows it wasn't an accident. Genevieve was too smart to slip. And that business with the missing ledger, mark my words, the Ashbury family has rot in the floorboards." Arthur clenched his jaw. Rumours. That was all that was left of his wife. Rumours that she had been unfaithful, that she had been a thief, that she had jumped to escape shame. He had fought 2 duels in the last 3 years to silence men who dared speak her name with disrespect. Across the room, Lady Rosalind awaited him. She was beautiful in a conventional way, blonde, pale, and utterly terrified of him. She was 22, rich and safe. She would never challenge him. She would never make him laugh until his sides ached. She would never vanish into the Thames. The grandfather clock in the hall began to chime. 11:45. 15 minutes until he signed his life away. Arthur signaled the conductor. The music swelled to a crescendo and then ceased. The room fell into an expectant hush. This was it. The moment the vultures had been waiting for. Arthur stepped onto the low dais at the end of the room. He looked out at the sea of faces, hundreds of London's most powerful people, all watching him with hungry eyes. "My lords, ladies and gentlemen," Arthur began, his voice projecting clearly to the back of the room, "I thank you for joining us on this holy night. It has been a difficult few years for this house." A murmur of sympathetic agreement rippled through the crowd. "But," Arthur continued, his eyes finding Rosalind in the front row. She offered him a shaky smile. "Time moves forward, and it is the duty of those remaining to build the future. Tonight I have an announcement regarding the future of the Ashbury line." He took a breath. He reached out a hand toward Rosalind. Boom! The sound was not a gunshot, but it was just as startling. The massive double doors at the far end of the ballroom, usually opened only by 2 footmen, were thrown wide with a force that shook the hinges. A gust of freezing wind swept into the warm room, extinguishing the candles nearest the entrance. The crowd gasped and turned as one. The footman, looking pale as a sheet, stumbled forward, his voice cracking. "Announcing!" The man swallowed hard, looking back at the open doorway, as if he were seeing an apparition. "Announcing Her Grace, the Duchess of Ashbury." Arthur froze. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Cruel, he thought, some sick joke. But then she stepped out of the shadows. She was not wearing the white of a ghost nor the black of a widow. She was dressed in crimson satin, a shade so dark it looked like blood in the moonlight. The dress was cut in the latest Parisian fashion daring, and sharp, unlike the modest gowns Evie used to wear. Her hair, once golden, was now a stark, striking auburn piled high on her head and secured with diamond pins that caught the light like shrapnel. She walked into the room, and the crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. She didn't look at the floor. She didn't look at the guests. She looked straight at the dais, straight at Arthur. It was Genevieve. But it wasn't the Evie he remembered. That Evie had been soft, full of light. This woman was forged from ice. A jagged scar ran from her hairline down to her left temple, a white line marring her perfect skin, a souvenir of death. The silence was absolute. You could hear the crackle of the fire. She stopped 10 feet from the dais. She looked at Rosalind, who was trembling, and then her gaze locked onto Arthur. "I apologize for my lateness, husband," Genevieve said. Her voice was raspier than before, deeper. "The traffic from the grave was murder." For 10 seconds, no one breathed. The shock was a physical weight in the room. Then the glass fell from the Dowager Duchess's hand, shattering on the parquet floor. The sound broke the spell. "Impossible," Augusta whispered, her face draining of all color. "You are dead. We buried you." Genevieve turned her head slowly to look at her mother-in-law. The movement was predatory. "You buried an empty coffin, Augusta. A theatrical gesture, but very you." Arthur descended the dais, his legs moving on instinct. He felt light-headed. He stopped inches from her. He could smell her, the familiar scent of jasmine, but layered now with something sharper. Gunpowder ozone. Evie, he choked out. He reached for her, his hand trembling. She didn't flinch, but she didn't lean into his touch either. Hello, Arthur. How? He grabbed her shoulders, needing to feel the solidity of her. She was real. She was warm. The police. The river. 3 years, Evie. 3 years. 3 years is a long time to hold your breath, she said dryly. Her eyes searched his face, and for a fleeting second the ice cracked. He saw a flash of the pain he had lived with every day. But she walled it off instantly. I see I interrupted a celebration. She glanced at Rosalind, who looked ready to faint. Lady Rosalind, you look lovely, though I'm afraid the position of Duchess is currently occupied. This is a fraud. The shout came from the side of the room. It was Percival Arthur's cousin, and the heir presumptive if Arthur died childless. Percival pushed his way through the crowd, his face red with wine and indignation. Genevieve Sterling is dead, Percival roared. I identified the cloak myself. This is an impostor, a fortune hunter trying to claim the estate. Genevieve laughed. It was a cold, dark sound. Cousin Percival, still shouting to compensate for your lack of wit, I see. She reached into the bodice of her crimson gown and pulled out a heavy object attached to a gold chain. She held it up. The room gasped. It was the Ashbury signet, the ducal ring that had been missing for generations long before Genevieve had even married Arthur. It was a massive emerald carved with the family crest. My grandfather's ring, Arthur whispered. How? It wasn't lost, Genevieve announced, her voice ringing out to the gallery. It was stolen, and I didn't die by accident, Arthur. I was pushed. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Pushed. Arthur's grip on her shoulders tightened. By whom? Genevieve's eyes swept the room, lingering on 3 people, Percival the Dowager Duchess, and a tall, shadowy man, standing near the exit, Lord Calloway, the king's adviser. We will get to that, she said. But first I believe I am owed a dance. It is the Christmas ball, is it not? You cannot be serious, Augusta hissed, stepping forward. You storm in here, desecrate a holy night with wild accusations and expect to waltz. I expect, Genevieve said, leaning in close to Arthur. Her voice dropping to a whisper only he could hear. To save your life, Arthur, again. Now take my hand, or they will kill you before the night is over. Arthur stared at her. He saw the terror hidden deep in her pupils. This wasn't a game. He turned to the conductor, who was watching with his baton raised in frozen confusion. Play, Arthur commanded. The Blue Danube. As the music began hesitant at first, then gaining strength, Arthur took his wife's waist. It was stiff, unyielding. They began to turn. Everyone is watching, Arthur murmured as he spun her past the gawking onlookers. Good, Genevieve replied, keeping a fake smile plastered on her face. Keep moving. Don't look at the balcony. Why? Because there is a man up there with a rifle, and he is waiting for a clear shot. Arthur missed a step. He tightened his grip on her. What are you talking about, Evie? Where have you been? France, then Italy, hiding in convents and brothels. Anywhere they wouldn't look for a duchess. Who is they? The Circle of Thorns, she whispered. Arthur froze. The Circle of Thorns was a myth, a nursery rhyme about a secret society that controlled the monarchy from the shadows. That's a fairy tale, Arthur scoffed. Is it? Genevieve spun him sharply to the left, narrowly missing a collision with a waiter. 3 years ago, I found a ledger in your father's old study. It detailed payments, bribes to Parliament, arms deals, and a plot to assassinate the Prince of Wales. Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. My father was a patriot. Your father was a pawn, she corrected. And when they found out I had the ledger, they sent a carriage to run me off the bridge. I managed to jump before it hit the water. I washed up near the docks. A fisherman found me. I've been recovering, planning. You should have come to me, Arthur said, hurt flashing in his eyes. I would have burned the world down to protect you. No, Arthur, she said softly, her hand sliding up to touch the nape of his neck. You are the worst liar I know. They would have seen through you. They would have killed you to get to me. I had to let you believe I was dead. It was the only way to keep you safe. They spun toward the center of the room. The guests were beginning to relax, thinking this was perhaps some elaborate eccentric performance. So why return now? Arthur asked. Because, Genevieve said, her eyes hardening. The assassination isn't a myth. It's scheduled for tonight. Here. Arthur stopped dancing. Here, why do you think the Prime Minister and the King's advisor are both here on Christmas Eve? It's a coup, Arthur, and your family is going to be the scapegoat. Suddenly, a glass shattered near the balcony. Down! Genevieve screamed. She shoved Arthur hard. He stumbled back, falling to the polished floor, just as a bullet chipped the marble pillar exactly where his head had been a second before. Screams erupted. The music died in a discordant screech. Genevieve didn't cower. She reached into the folds of her crimson dress and, to the absolute horror of the London elite, pulled out a small pearl-handled revolver. She aimed it at the balcony and fired. A body tumbled from the shadows above, crashing onto the buffet table in a spray of punch and crystal. Genevieve stood over Arthur, the gun smoking in her hand, her chest heaving. She looked like a vengeful angel. Merry Christmas, darling, she said. Now help me up. We have a conspiracy to dismantle. Pandemonium. That was the only word for it. Ladies in silk gowns were diving under tables. The Earl of Derby was trying to crawl into the fireplace. The orchestra had fled, leaving their instruments scattered like driftwood. Arthur scrambled to his feet, his ears ringing. He looked at the man who had fallen from the balcony. He was dressed in the livery of the Ashbury staff, but Arthur didn't recognize him. A hired gun. The doors! Genevieve shouted, pointing the revolver toward the main entrance. Don't let Percival leave! Arthur turned just in time to see his cousin sprinting toward the exit, his face pale with panic. Stop him! Arthur bellowed. Two loyal footmen, recovering from their shock, tackled Percival just as he reached the brass handles. They dragged him back, kicking and screaming toward the center of the room. Get off me! I am a peer of the realm, Percival shrieked. You are a rat, Genevieve said, stepping forward. She didn't lower the gun. The Dowager Duchess Augusta emerged from behind a velvet sofa. She looked disheveled, her wig slightly askew. Genevieve, have you lost your mind? You just killed a man. I killed an assassin, Augusta, Genevieve snapped. Check his pockets. I wager you'll find a note with Arthur's schedule on it. Arthur knelt by the dead man. He rifled through the blood-soaked coat. Sure enough, there was a folded piece of parchment. He opened it. Midnight, during the toast. Make it look like a jealous lover. Arthur felt bile rise in his throat. He stood up, staring at Percival. You, Percival spat on the floor. You were ruining everything, Arthur. With your morality, The circle offered us power. True power, not just this fading title. "Where is the ledger?" a deep voice boomed. Lord Calloway, the king's advisor, stepped out from the shadows of the pillars. He was a bear of a man holding a cane that looked heavy enough to crack a skull. He wasn't panicking like the others. He looked annoyed. "Ah," Genevieve said, turning the gun toward Calloway. "The spider reveals himself." "Put the toy away, my dear," Calloway said smoothly. "You have made a mess, but we can still salvage this. Give me the ledger you stole, and perhaps I will let your husband live." "The ledger?" Genevieve smiled. It was a terrifying expression. "I don't have the ledger on me, Lord Calloway." "Then you are useless," Calloway signaled with his hand. From the side doors, the servants' entrances, 6 men emerged. They were armed with knives and cudgels. The guests screamed again. "Arthur," Genevieve said, her voice steady. "Do you remember the fencing lessons we took in Vienna?" Arthur reached for the ceremonial sword hanging above the fireplace. It wasn't sharp, but it was heavy steel. He ripped it from the wall. "I remember," Arthur said, standing back to back with his wife. The adrenaline was flooding his system, washing away 3 years of grief. She was here. She was alive. And they were fighting together. "I always beat you." "Only because I let you," she retorted. "Kill them all," Calloway roared. The thugs charged. What followed was not a graceful duel, but a brutal brawl. Arthur swung the heavy sword like a club, catching the first attacker in the ribs with a sickening crunch. Genevieve fired her remaining shot into the knee of a second man, then used the pistol as a hammer to strike a third across the temple. It was chaotic. It was violent. It was the most alive Arthur had felt since the day she disappeared. But there were too many of them. Arthur was backed against the dais, swinging wildly. A knife slashed his sleeve, drawing blood. "Evie, run!" he shouted. "Not without you." Calloway was advancing on Genevieve, his heavy cane raised. She was cornered against the overturned buffet table. "Goodbye, Duchess," Calloway sneered. Suddenly a whistle blew, a piercing, shrill sound that cut through the noise. Windows shattered inward. Men in dark blue uniforms swarmed into the ballroom from the terrace, wielding truncheons and revolvers. "Scotland Yard!" a voice bellowed. "Drop your weapons!" Leading them was Inspector Aberline, a man Arthur knew well. The thugs froze. Calloway lowered his cane, looking around wildly. "It's over, Calloway," Genevieve said, breathless. She reached into her bodice again, but this time she didn't pull out a ring. She pulled out a small leather-bound book. "I didn't bring the ledger to the dance," she said, holding it up. "I mailed it to Inspector Aberline this morning, along with a letter explaining exactly who would be at this party." Calloway's face turned purple. You treacherous witch." "Arrest them," Aberline commanded. As the police handcuffed Calloway and Percival, and the society guests began to sob in relief, Arthur dropped his sword. He didn't care about the police. He didn't care about the scandal. He walked over to Genevieve. She was trembling now, the adrenaline fading. She looked at him, her eyes wide and vulnerable. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry I left you." Arthur didn't speak. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her. It was a desperate, hungry kiss, tasting of blood and tears and snow. The room erupted in applause. No. They were too shocked for that. They just watched in stunned silence as the Duke of Ashbury reclaimed his wife. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. As the police dragged Percival away, He shouted one last thing, a sentence that made Genevieve stiffen in Arthur's arms. "You think you've won, Genevieve? You think the ledger is the only secret? Ask her, Arthur. Ask her about the child." Arthur pulled back, looking down at his wife. "Child? What is he talking about?" Genevieve's face went paler than when she had faced the gun. She looked down at her stomach, then back at Arthur. "I was pregnant when I went into the river, Arthur," she whispered. Arthur stopped breathing. And, she said, tears finally spilling over. "I didn't lose him. He's hidden in a safe house in Cornwall. You have a son, Arthur. He is 2 years old." Arthur fell to his knees. The ballroom of Ashbury House had seen many things in 200 years. Duels, proposals, financial ruin. But it had never seen the 9th Duke on his knees, broken by a hope so agonizing it felt like despair. Around them, the wreckage of the Christmas ball was being cleared. Inspector Aberline's men were hauling away the unconscious hired thugs and the sputtering Lord Calloway. Percival, screaming threats of legal action and familial betrayal, had already been dragged out into the snow. The society guests, those vultures in silk and velvet, were finally leaving. Their initial shock had morphed into a frantic need to spread the gossip. This would be the scandal of the decade. The Duke's dead wife, returning with a gun, a conspiracy, and a secret heir. Arthur remained on the floor, staring at the polished parquet where his wife's blood had once been rumored to be stained. He looked up at Genevieve. She had holstered the small revolver, and without the weapon she suddenly looked impossibly fragile. The adrenaline that had sustained her entry was crashing. She was shaking her crimson dress, a stark contrast to her pale skin. "A son," Arthur repeated, his voice a cracked ruin of its former baritone. "You let me mourn. You let me build a shrine to you in my heart. And all the while you were raising my son." Genevieve flinched. "Arthur, please, not here." "Where?" he demanded, rising to his feet. His grief was calcifying rapidly into a towering rage. "Where is the appropriate place to discuss the fact that you stole 3 years of my life and the entire infancy of my child?" He didn't wait for an answer. He grabbed her wrist, not gently, but with a desperate possession, and hauled her through the thinning crowd, past the gaping waiters, and out of the ballroom. He didn't stop until they reached his private library on the ground floor, slamming the heavy oak door behind them and turning the key in the lock. The room was dark, lit only by the dying embers of the fireplace. It smelled of leather old paper and the whiskey he had been drinking too much of these past 3 years. He let go of her wrist and stalked to the fireplace, gripping the mantelpiece until his knuckles turned white. He couldn't look at her. If he looked at her, he might shatter or he might strangle her. He wasn't sure which. "Explain," he commanded to the fire. "And do not lie to me, Genevieve. If you lie to me tonight, I will never forgive you." Behind him he heard the rustle of her satin dress. "When I found the ledger," she began, her voice tremulous, "I knew what it meant. Your father had been blackmailed into the circle of thorns years ago. When he died, they expected you to take his place. They were grooming Percival as a backup in case you proved too moral." Arthur whipped around. "So you decided to protect me by destroying me." They were watching the house, Arthur. They had spies among the staff. If I had told you, you would have reacted exactly as you are reacting now, with rage. You would have charged at Calloway, and they would have killed you in a duel or a staged accident within the week. She stepped closer, the firelight catching the tears spilling down her cheeks. "I was 2 months pregnant when the carriage ran me off Blackfriars Bridge. I didn't know for sure until a week later, when I was shivering in a fisherman's hut in Rotherhithe, bleeding and terrified. The image hit Arthur hard. His pampered, beautiful Evie injured and alone in a hovel. "I wanted to come back," she sobbed. "Every day, I wanted to come back." But then I felt him move. And I knew. I knew if the circle knew I was alive, if they knew there was an heir, they wouldn't just kill me. They would take him. They would raise him to be one of them, just as they tried to do with you. She reached into her dress again, not for a weapon this time, but for a small locket hidden beneath the crimson fabric. She unclasped it and held it out with a trembling hand. Arthur hesitated. He was terrified of what was inside. Slowly he took the warm metal and opened it. It was a miniature portrait freshly painted. A little boy with a mop of unruly dark hair. Ashbury hair and enormous, serious blue eyes that were entirely Genevieve's. He was clutching a wooden toy soldier. Arthur's knees threatened to buckle again. He traced the face of the stranger in the locket with his thumb. "His name," Genevieve whispered, "is Thomas, after your grandfather, the one whose ring I stole back. Thomas, his son." The rage didn't vanish, but it was suddenly swamped by a tidal wave of paternal longing, so fierce it stole his breath. He had a son, a living, breathing piece of Evie and himself. "He is in Cornwall," Arthur said, his voice thick. "Yes, in a cottage near St. Ives. An old governess of mine, Mrs. Gable, is watching him. She is the only person in the world besides you who knows the truth." "Is he safe?" Genevieve hesitated. That hesitation was like a knife in Arthur's gut. "Calloway is arrested," she said rapidly. "But the circle is vast. Calloway was just the London head. There are others. If news gets out tonight, and it will, that I am alive, they will assume the ledger isn't the only leverage I have. They will look for weaknesses." Arthur snapped the locket shut, his decision made instantly. The society ball, the scandal, his mother's vaporings, none of it mattered. "We have to go to him," Arthur said. "Now." "Arthur, the blizzard. It's 2 feet deep outside and still falling. No carriage can make it to Cornwall tonight. Then we will take the train as far as Exeter and ride the rest of the way if we have to. I am not leaving my son unprotected for another hour." He crossed the room to his desk and unlocked a drawer, pulling out 2 heavy service revolvers and a pouch of ammunition. He shoved one into his waistband and held the other out to her. "You said you wanted to save me, Evie," he said, his eyes hard and brilliant. "Prove it. We are going to get our boy." The journey out of London was a nightmare, draped in white. The blizzard of 1894 was historic in its ferocity. It was the kind of weather that ended lives, freezing the homeless on doorsteps and stalling trains on the tracks. Arthur had paid a king's ransom to a stable master near Paddington to secure a closed carriage with 4 sturdy horses. The driver, a man named O'Connell, who seemed to fear neither God nor weather, agreed only because Arthur offered him enough gold to buy his own farm in Ireland. Inside the carriage, the temperature hovered just above freezing. Arthur had wrapped Genevieve in 3 wool blankets and his own fur-lined greatcoat over her ridiculous crimson ball gown. They sat across from each other in the dim, rocking interior, the silence heavy between them. The only sounds were the muffled screams of the wind outside, the straining of the horses, and the crunch of wheels cutting through deep drifts. Every so often, a flare of gaslight from a passing street lamp would illuminate Genevieve's face. She looked exhausted, dark circles bruised under her eyes, the scar on her temple standing out starkly against her pale skin. Arthur couldn't stop staring at her. She was a ghost made flesh. She was the villain who had broken his heart, and the hero who had saved his life. He hated her for the lies, and he loved her with a desperate, agonizing intensity that 3 years of mourning hadn't dulled in the slightest. "You're staring," she murmured, her voice raspy from the cold. "I'm trying to decide if you are real," Arthur replied flatly, "or if I finally drank enough whiskey to hallucinate the Christmas I wanted. If this were a hallucination, Arthur, I'd like to think you'd imagine me warmer." She shivered violently beneath the furs. Without thinking, Arthur moved. He crossed the small space between them and sat beside her, pulling her rigid body against his own. He wrapped his arms around the bundle of blankets, sharing his body heat. She stiffened at first, a reflex born of 3 years of solitude and survival. Then with a small, broken sigh, she melted against him, resting her head on his shoulder. The scent of her jasmine and ozone filled his senses. It was the smell of home. "Tell me about him," Arthur commanded softly into her hair. "Tell me everything. Does he walk? Does he talk? What makes him laugh?" For the next 2 hours, as the carriage battled its way slowly out of the sprawling metropolis and into the snow-blind countryside, Genevieve talked. She told him about Thomas's first steps in a sandy cottage garden. She told him about his obsession with seagulls and how he hated porridge but loved peaches, which cost her a fortune to import to Cornwall. She told him how, when he was angry, he furrowed his brow exactly the way Arthur was doing right now. "He asks about his father." Genevieve whispered, her hand finding Arthur's in the darkness under the blankets. "I told him his papa was a great captain sailing the seas, fighting pirates. I told him you were brave and that you loved him very much, but you had important work to do." Arthur felt a hot tear track down his cheek. "Another lie, Evie. A necessary one. How do you explain a tombstone to a 2-year-old? We have so much to undo," Arthur said, tightening his grip on her hand until it must have hurt. "When we get him back—" "Genevieve, I don't know how we fix this. The trust. We fix it by keeping him alive," she said fiercely. "That is all that matters." Suddenly the carriage lurched violently to the left. The horses screamed. Arthur was thrown against the side wall, taking Genevieve with him. The carriage shuddered to a halt, tilted at a precarious angle. "O'Connell!" Arthur shouted, banging on the roof trapdoor. "What happened?" The trapdoor didn't open. Instead, they heard a whip crack, not hitting horseflesh, but something else. A gunshot rang out, sharp and flat in the snowy silence. Then another. Then the sickening thud of a body falling onto the roof of the carriage. Arthur shoved Genevieve down onto the floorboards. "Stay down!" He drew the revolver from his waistband, cocked it, and kicked the carriage door open. The cold hit him like a physical blow, snow stinging his eyes, blinding him instantly. He tumbled out into thigh-deep snow. The carriage had been forced off the road into a ditch. O'Connell was gone from the driver's seat, the thud they had heard. Through the swirling whiteout, Arthur saw shapes. 4 horsemen, black silhouettes against the snow surrounding the carriage. They were wrapped in heavy cloaks, their faces obscured. "Ashbury!" one of them shouted over the wind. It wasn't Calloway's refined tones. This was a rougher voice, a hired killer. "Calloway sends his regards. He figured the bitch wouldn't travel alone." They hadn't been following them from the ball. They had been waiting on the main road out of London, anticipating a run for safety. "Get back in the carriage, Arthur!" Genevieve screamed from the doorway. She had his second gun in her hand. "Fire!" the rider commanded. Arthur threw himself flat into the snow, just as 2 bullets tore into the wood of the carriage door, where he had been standing a second before. He fired back blindly, aiming for the largest shadow. A horse reared up, screaming, dumping its rider into a snowdrift. Genevieve leaned out of the carriage, braving the return fire. She held the heavy service revolver with both hands, taking aim with the cold precision she had shown in the ballroom. Bang! One of the riders crumpled in his saddle, clutching his shoulder. "Two down!" Arthur yelled, scrambling to his feet and using the carriage wheels for cover. The remaining two riders split up, circling the stranded carriage like wolves. They were professional calm under fire. One rider charged Arthur's position. Arthur waited, breath held, until he could see the steam rising from the horse's nostrils. He fired. The bullet missed the rider, but hit the horse in the chest. The animal collapsed, throwing the man forward into the snow at Arthur's feet. Arthur was on him, instantly pressing the hot barrel of his gun against the man's forehead, beneath his wool hood. "Who sent you?" Arthur roared, the rage of the last 3 years pouring out of him. "Calloway is in jail." The man laughed, a wet, gurgling sound, blood bubbling on his lips. The circle has no end, Duke. You cut off one head, another grows. The boy, we know about the boy in Cornwall." Arthur went cold. They knew. Calloway must have suspected and sent word before his arrest. The man reached for a boot knife. Arthur didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. The silence returned, save for the wind. "Arthur," Genevieve called out, her voice shaking. "I'm here," he said, standing up, shaking from adrenaline and cold. The fourth rider had fled into the storm, realizing the odds had turned. The first rider Arthur had unhorsed was gone, too likely crawling away into the dark. They were alone on a frozen road, miles from help, with a dead driver on the roof and 2 corpses in the snow. Arthur trudged back to the carriage door. Genevieve was waiting, the gun still clutched in her white-knuckled hands. He looked at her, snow matting his hair and beard blood that wasn't his on his coat. "They know about Thomas," he said flatly. "The one I killed confirmed it." Genevieve let out a strangled cry. "No, oh God, no. Mrs. Gable is alone with him. They have no protection." "Can you ride?" Arthur asked, looking at the 2 remaining carriage horses that were tangled in their traces, panicked but unhurt. Genevieve looked down at her ruined ball gown, then at the freezing night. She nodded fiercely. "Yes." "Then we cut the leaders loose. We ride. If we stop, we freeze. If we don't get her there by dawn tomorrow, we lose our son." Arthur pulled out a pocket knife and began hacking at the frozen leather traces. They were leaving the carriage, the warmth and safety behind. They were riding into the heart of the storm. 2 parents, desperate to outrun death to the coast. The ride to Cornwall was not a journey. It was a descent into a frozen purgatory. They had cut the traces of the carriage horses, mounting the terrified beasts bareback, with nothing but the leather reins wrapped around their frozen hands. Arthur took the lead, his chest breaking the wind, while Genevieve rode close behind, her crimson ball gown bunched up around her thighs, stiff with ice. They rode until the horses' lungs heaved like bellows, their sweat freezing instantly on their flanks. They rode through the sleeping villages of Somerset, where shuttered windows offered no comfort, and across the bleak, wind-scoured expanse of Dartmoor. Hour by hour, the barrier between noble and savage eroded. Arthur was no longer a duke. He was simply a man consumed by the primal need to protect his blood. Genevieve was no longer a duchess or a ghost. She was a mother, fueled by a terrifying, singular love. Somewhere near Exeter, the storm finally broke. The heavy grey clouds fractured, revealing a cold, indifferent moon. But the temperature plummeted further. "We have to stop," Arthur rasped, slowing his horse. His voice was a ruin. Just for an hour. The horses will die, Evie. And so will we. No, she croaked, her lips blue. We can't. If we freeze to death, Thomas has no one, Arthur argued, maneuvering his horse alongside hers. He reached out and touched her face. Her skin was like marble. Look at me. You can barely hold the reins. They found a dilapidated coaching inn on the outskirts of Oakhampton. It was little more than a hovel with a stable, but to them it was a palace. Arthur practically carried Genevieve inside, kicking open the door and startling a slumbering innkeeper who looked ready to reach for a blunderbuss until Arthur threw a handful of gold sovereigns onto the table. Fresh horses, Arthur commanded, his eyes wild and red-rimmed. The best you have, and hot broth, now. While the innkeeper scrambled, Arthur sat Genevieve by the hearth. He knelt before her, chafing her frozen hands between his own. The heat of the fire began to thaw the ice on her dress, turning the crimson satin dark with water. He has your eyes, Genevieve whispered, staring into the flames. She was delirious with exhaustion. I wanted you to know that. If we don't get there. He has your eyes. We will get there, Arthur swore, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. And I will see them for myself. But you must tell me, Evie, why didn't you send word in 3 years? Not a letter. Not a signal. Genevieve pulled her hand away, wrapping her arms around herself. Because I knew you, Arthur. The old you. You were reckless. You were loud. You wore your heart on your sleeve. If I had told you I was alive, you would have come for me. You would have brought the British Army if you could. And the Circle would have seen it. They would have killed us both before I even began to show. Arthur looked down. It was a bitter pill, but he swallowed it. She was right. 3 years ago, he had been a boy playing at being a duke, arrogant, untouchable. Grief had carved him into a man. I hated you for leaving me, Arthur admitted, his voice low. Every morning I woke up, reached for you, and found cold sheets. I cursed your name. I know, she said, tears tracking through the grime on her face. I felt your hate. It kept me warm. It meant you still cared. I never stopped loving you, he said. That was the problem. The hate was just love with nowhere to go. The innkeeper returned with 2 mugs of steaming beef broth and news that 2 fresh cobs were saddled. They drank the broth in slants, the scalding liquid burning their throats, shocking their bodies back to life. 10 minutes. That was all they took. They were back in the saddle before the warmth had even settled in their bones. The final leg of the journey was a blur of exhaustion. The landscape shifted from the rolling hills of Devon to the rugged granite cliffs of Cornwall. The air grew saltier, the wind sharper. As the sun began to bleed a bruised purple light over the horizon, they crested the final hill overlooking St. Ives. The ocean roared below a chaotic churn of grey foam. There, Genevieve cried out, pointing with a trembling hand. Set apart from the village, perched precariously on a cliff edge known as Man's Head, was a small stone cottage. It looked solitary, defiant against the sea. But there was no smoke rising from the chimney, and the front door was hanging off its hinges. Arthur felt a spike of adrenaline so potent it nearly stopped his heart. He kicked his horse into a gallop, the animal skidding on the loose shale of the path. "Thomas!" Genevieve screamed, her voice tearing from her throat. They didn't bother with the reins. They bailed off the moving horses as they neared the garden gate. Arthur drew his revolver, his fatigue vanishing instantly. The garden was trampled. The winter cabbages were crushed into the mud by heavy boots. Arthur signaled Genevieve to stay back, but she ignored him, pulling her own weapon and rushing toward the open door. They burst into the cottage together. The main room was a wreck, tables overturned, crockery smashed. And there, lying near the hearth, was Mrs. Gable. The stout, grey-haired woman who had nursed Genevieve through her secret pregnancy was slumped against the stones, a dark stain spreading on her apron. "Mrs. Gable," Genevieve dropped to her knees, checking for a pulse. "I'm still here." The old woman wheezed, opening one eye. "Took more than one of them to put me down." "Where is he?" Arthur demanded, scanning the room. "Where is Thomas?" Mrs. Gable coughed, pointing a shaking finger toward the back door that led to the cliffs. "They took him 10 minutes ago. The man with the scar." The fourth rider, the one who had escaped the ambush. "He said to bring the ledger," Mrs. Gable whispered, "or the boy flies." Arthur didn't wait. He sprinted through the kitchen and out the back door into the roaring wind of the cliffs. The cliffside behind the cottage was a jagged shelf of granite that dropped 300 feet straight down into the churning Atlantic. The wind here was ferocious, carrying the spray of the waves that crashed against the rocks below. Arthur spotted them instantly. 50 yards away, standing on a narrow precipice, was the assassin. He was a giant of a man, his face wrapped in a scarf, but his eyes were cold and dead. And in his arm, dangling precariously over the void, was a small bundle wrapped in a blue wool blanket. A child. The boy was crying a thin, terrified wail that was snatched away by the wind, but to Arthur it sounded louder than the storm. "Stop!" Arthur roared, raising his gun. The assassin turned, using the child as a shield. "Drop it, Duke, or I drop the spare air." Genevieve stumbled out behind Arthur. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Thomas! Mama!" the boy screamed, seeing her. He kicked his small legs, making the assassin stumble slightly on the slick rock. "Easy, brat," the killer growled, shaking the boy. "What do you want?" Arthur shouted, lowering the gun slowly. "You want money? I can give you more than the Circle ever could. I will give you the keys to the Ashbury vaults." "The Circle doesn't pay in gold, Ashbury," the man sneered. "They pay in order, and you are chaos. You and this witch." He nodded at Genevieve. "Calloway gave the order. If he goes down the line, ends. Root and stem." "You can't escape," Genevieve pleaded. Stepping forward, her hands raised in surrender. "The police are behind us. Aberline knows your face. Killing a child won't save you." "Maybe not." The man smiled behind his scarf. "But it will hurt you, and that's enough." He shifted his weight, preparing to toss the bundle into the abyss. Time seemed to warp. Arthur saw the muscles in the man's arm tense. He saw the terror in his son's eyes that were indeed identical to his own. He couldn't shoot. The risk of hitting Thomas was too high. The wind was too strong. But Genevieve didn't have a gun. She had something else. Throughout the journey, she had kept the heavy Ashbury signet ring, the one she had brandished at the ball, clenched in her fist or pocket. Now, as she moved, she didn't aim a weapon. She aimed her voice. "Look at me," she screamed, not a plea, but a command that carried the full weight of her rage. The assassin hesitated for a fraction of a second, surprised by the ferocity. In that microsecond, Arthur didn't shoot the man. He shot the ground. He aimed his heavy service revolver at the shelf of shale rock directly beneath the assassin's boots. Crack, crack. The frozen, brittle stone, already weakened by the cliff's erosion, shattered under the impact of the heavy caliber bullets. The ledge gave way. The assassin shouted as his footing vanished. He fell backward, his arms flailing for balance. In his panic, his grip loosened. The blue bundle flew from his arms, not into the sea, but tumbling onto the grassy verge, just inches from the edge. The assassin didn't find purchase. With a final silent scream, he plummeted into the grey mist below, swallowed by the ocean. "Thomas!" Arthur and Genevieve lunged at the same time. Arthur threw his body onto the wet grass, sliding dangerously close to the drop, and grabbed the back of the blue coat just as the wind threatened to roll the boy over the edge. He hauled the child back, curling his body around him, burying the boy's face in his chest. Genevieve collapsed on top of them, wrapping her arms around both Arthur and Thomas. For a long moment there was no sound but the wind and the jagged, sobbing breaths of the three of them. Arthur felt the small, solid weight of his son. He felt the rapid beat of the boy's heart against his own. He smelled the scent of milk and fear. "It's all right." Arthur choked out tears, finally streaming freely, mixing with the salt spray. "It's all right. Papa is here. Mama is here." Thomas, shocked into silence, looked up. He had Genevieve's nose and Arthur's dark curls. He looked from the weeping woman to the bearded, bloody stranger holding him. "Papa," the boy whispered, touching Arthur's rough cheek. "Pirate!" Arthur let out a wet, broken laugh. Yes, I'm the pirate. And I'm never leaving again." 3 months later. The snows of London had long since melted, replaced by the pale, hopeful green of English spring. Grosvenor Square was bustling with carriages, and the gossip rags had finally moved on to a new scandal involving a chorus girl and an earl, though none would ever rival the Resurrection Ball. The library of Ashbury House was transformed. The dark curtains were pulled back, letting the afternoon sun flood the room. Arthur sat in his armchair, a ledger open on his lap. Not the black ledger of treason which was now locked in the deepest vault of Scotland Yard, but the estate ledgers. The Ashbury fortune, thanks to the recovery of assets stolen by the Circle's agents, was recovering. The door creaked open. Thomas, now a robust 3-year-old, toddled in holding a wooden sword. He charged at Arthur's legs. "Defend yourself!" the boy shrieked with glee. Arthur dropped the book and caught the boy, swinging him up into the air until Thomas squealed with delight. "You have terrible form, Lord Greystoke," Arthur teased, setting him on his knee. "We must work on your parry." "He gets his lack of coordination from you, I'm afraid." Genevieve leaned against the doorframe. She was radiant. The scar on her temple was still there, a thin white line that she made no effort to hide with powder or hair. It was her badge of honor. She wore a dress of soft blue, the color of the Cornish sea on a calm day. She walked over to them, resting her hand on Arthur's shoulder. He reached up and covered her hand with his, squeezing it. The rings were back on her finger, the wedding band, and the heavy emerald signet. "The Prime Minister is downstairs," Genevieve said. "He wants to discuss the reorganization of the House of Lords. He says your testimony regarding the Circle has cleared the way for significant reforms." Arthur sighed, nuzzling his face against her hand. "Tell him I am busy." "Busy doing what?" "Teaching my son how to fight pirates," Arthur said, looking at her with a love that was steady, deep, and terrifyingly real. "And adoring my wife." Genevieve smiled, and for the first time in 4 years, there were no shadows in her eyes, no secrets, no ghosts. "He can wait," she agreed, bending down to kiss them both. We have all the time in the world. The truth that no one had imagined at the Christmas ball was not just that the Duchess was alive or that there was an heir. The truth was that some bonds are forged in fire and ice, and not even death can break them. The Duke and Duchess of Ashbury had returned from the dead not to reclaim a title, but to reclaim a life. And this time, they would live it. And that is the incredible, heart-pounding story of the miracle of Grosvenor Square. From a grieving widower to a warrior father and a society wife to a fierce protector. Arthur and Genevieve's story reminds us that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones fought for the people we love. If you enjoyed this journey through Victorian intrigue, betrayal, and romance, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. What did you think of Genevieve's secret? Would you have forgiven her? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next chapter.